Today we're going to talk about scientific reasoning, and specifically we're going to talk about what's known as data representation. Now, the scientific reasoning part of the ACT, which these next three classes are going to be ACT preparation, the scientific reasoning part, it's important to understand that this does not actually test your understanding of specific scientific facts. What they want to test is your ability to solve puzzles that are scientifically oriented, to read graphs and charts, to be able to read those graphs and charts and draw conclusions or inferences, and work with facts, evidence, and data. And so, in order to do that, they separate this into three sections. But what they want specifically is to know that you understand and you have the ability to know what a passage is saying in regards to science, that you can analyze a passage that allows you to find a deeper meaning, and that you can make inferences, which means to make generalizations from trends in specific data. So when you look at a question or a problem in the data representation section, you have to ask yourself, what is this question really all about? You must understand and evaluate the information from tables, charts, graphs, and diagrams. And I've given, in your homework, you have several passages to work through. And I will go over a couple, one that's fairly straightforward, looking at tables, and another that's a little bit more complex to help you understand what we're after. So the scientific reasoning section of the ACT is divided into three parts. The first of these parts is what is known as data representation, and that's what we're going to talk about today. In that part, you have to know the variables and their values, what is essentially the x-axis and the y-axis on a graph, or what one column represents versus a row on a table. You need to be able to analyze the data. In other words, you need to be able to see relationships in the data. You need to see what is implied by these relationships. And then also, you need to be able to make generalizations and potentially suggest future study from the data. The next two sections, which will be the next 2 weeks, include research summaries, which is in many ways a review of the scientific method that we talked about last week. In that area, you identify the problem in the data, you make conclusions from the data compared to controls, and you see how that can be generalized more broadly. Now, the scientific research study summaries are designed to sort of in the opposite. In other words, instead of you devising the experiment, they show you the experiment as it was done, and then you interpret or go through the results. And so it's sort of the reverse of what we did last week. Then lastly, the last part is called conflicting hypotheses, and by every measure, this is the most complicated and difficult, because in a way, you have to understand 2 points of view. You have to see where they agree and disagree, particularly about the facts. And then you have to see how the two conclusions are relevant and answer questions that show other generalizations that might be done and which argument they are more likely to have come from. But we'll go over this in detail in a couple of weeks. So for data representation, what we do is we're looking at information, which is what data is. It's just information about the study. It's usually presented in a chart, graph, sometimes a picture. There are various ways to represent data, and again, I will show you some ways in our examples. You will be asked to analyze the data and answer questions about it. You have to be able to identify the variables, that is, which one's the dependent variable, which one's the independent variable. And you have to make sure you pay attention to what's known as chart notes, which includes things like the units involved and so forth. Make sure you look at the scale of the graph or picture if there is one. And you have to make sure you look at all the specific information so that you can come to the right conclusions. So when you see these charts or graphs and look at the situation, you ask yourself 4 basic questions. First of all, what are the units of measure? It's important to understand the units of measure. By the way, when you answer any question in my class, you have to include the units or the answer is incomplete, and there will be a deduction for that. What are the values of the variables? In other words, how are the variables expressed in terms of units, but also what are those values? Then you look at the data as a whole and see if there are any trends in the information. Is it consistently increasing? Is it consistently decreasing? When you double one factor, does that mean it doubles another factor? And this goes to the next question, which is, are there any correlations? That is, are there any specific relationships that you can see by looking at the data? As I said, if you double one, does that mean you double the other? If you double one, does that mean the other goes up by 4-fold, etc.? So those are things you look at and ask yourself questions about before you even start answering the specific questions for the problem. You need to remember certain things from our previous lecture. First of all, you need to remember what a variable is. A variable is one of the things that changes during an experiment that you are measuring. So, for example, if you're measuring the temperature and relating that to the amount of heat put into how long you heat a cup of water, one variable is the temperature and the other is the amount of heat you're putting in. The independent variable is the variable that you change as the experimental. In this, my verbal example, it would be the amount of heat you add to the water. The dependent variable is the change being measured as the independent variable is changed. That is the impact of the change in the independent variable on the other variable that you're measuring. We will look at this specifically when we get to the examples. So what do you know? You need to underline keywords that will help you. Many times these keywords include the name of the diagram, the units of the diagram, and the titles for columns or axes in the data. So there are several kinds of representations that are usually given in the scientific reasoning section. One of the most common is shown here. It's the line graph. And it shows generally how something changes over a specific span of a variable. Line graphs are commonly used with time. Here you have on the x-axis the year, and on the y-axis the number of individuals. The title is Number of Common Dolphins Seen in Santa Barbara Channel from 1996 to 2001. Okay, so this is a data representation of a period of time which is outlined here from 1996 to 2001. The independent variable is the year. This is the part that you're not actually changing it, but you are setting as the standard. And it's the dependent or independent variable is almost always on the x-axis of a line graph. The dependent variable is the counting that you do, the data or the number of dolphins that are seen in the channel in each year. So here's and it's obviously in thousands of dolphins. So in 1996, there was a little bit less than 2,000 and quite a bit more than 1,000. And there is a specific way to estimate this. If this distance is, say, a centimeter, and this distance is, say, 0.8 of a centimeter, then you would estimate this at 1,800, because you would take 8 over 10 times the difference between these two, which is 1,000, and add that to the bottom one. So that's 1,800. So there were approximately 1,800 dolphins seen in 1996. Then it shot up to what appears to be about 7,500 dolphins seen in 1997. Then it dropped down to about 5,000, a little less than 5,000 dolphins seen in 1998. And then a little over 6,000 seen in 1999. And you can see the way this graph looks that there's no consistent pattern here, except maybe initially you have it shoots up, but if you were to draw a line to try to connect all these points, it would essentially go up and then level off after that. So that would be the sort of change over time that you would look at. Now it asks here, look at the main message of the graph. The main message here is that the number of dolphins rose in the first year and then remained relatively stable after that first year. A second way to represent information is what's known as a bar graph. Bar graphs are commonly used to show either similarities or differences between two different data sets. They can be set up as this is, horizontally, or probably more commonly you're used to seeing a vertical. And the scale is used to compare one data set with another. Again, you want to look at the main message for this. So you have three products, X, which is represented by the orange bar, Y, which is represented by this color bar that I have no idea what color that is, and Z, which is represented by this bar. And here you have its quarters, first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. These are sales. And the sales are measured in 3, 6, 8, 9, 12, 15 thousands of dollars. Now, there's a few things you can see. In each quarter, for example, if you just separate quarters, the sales of product Z appears to always be the most, and the sale of product Y always seems to be the least. Even in quarters that all the sales dropped, Z is still the most sales and Y is the least. Now, it breaks that trend here. Z still is the most, but Y apparently rallied this time for the last two quarters. But Z is always the most. So that's one trend you could possibly see, is that if somebody could ask a question, which product always has the most sales regardless of the quarter? And then another question would be, what happens to if you compare the sales of Y and X, what happens between the first half of the year and the second half of the year? Things like that. And so those are the kind of things you want to look for in a bar graph. And then thirdly, it's tables. Now the advantage of tables is you have the exact values. The disadvantage of tables is relationships are harder to see, and you have to sort of look at, make certain assumptions. Like here, for example, you have three situations in which all three of these are the same, but these change and these change. So there may be some sort of relationship, say, between this and this when these are the same. Things of that nature. And so the nice thing about tables is if you're asked a specific question about a specific situation, you can find the specific number easily. If, on the other hand, you were asked for trends, sometimes you have to look more carefully to find trends. Now you'll notice that this constantly goes up. Okay, so that's very much similar to a situation where you have a graph that constantly goes up. And you might look here and say, well, this constantly goes up as well, so maybe these two are related. And this constantly goes up, so maybe all of these three are related in some way. So those are the kinds of things you have to identify in terms of relationships between these various types. So one thing we will talk about in about 3 weeks is the metric system and various means of measurement. So you don't know these yet. So it's saying, do you remember? You don't remember because you haven't had it yet. And so we will talk about the metric system and the various prefixes in 3 weeks. You also sometimes will be required to make conversions. Once you learn the metric system, you will be able to do these sorts of conversions. I've already commented on X versus Y axis. And we will talk about direct versus indirect correlation and inversely proportionate. We will talk about when we go over the examples.